Welcome to this webinar on what is off-the-job training and how does it work. This is an introductory session aimed at employers. By registering and attending this webinar, you're giving your consent and agreeing for the webinar to be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. If you've changed your mind regarding consent, can I please ask you to dial off? Today, I'll be joined by Karen Clark from the Apprenticeship Funding Policy Team and by Rob Cole from the Apprenticeship Quality Policy Team, who will be taking you through the main inputs for today's webinar. So I'll stop talking now and I'll hand over to Rob. Rob, over to you.
Great, thanks Nick. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rob and I work on the team that is responsible for the off-the-job training policy. As the policy owners, we monitor the delivery of off-the-job training predominantly from a quality perspective. This is to make sure that it delivers new and relevant training that will help an apprentice to become occupationally competent and, where applicable, ready to undertake an endpoint assessment.
And hi everyone, my name's Karen and I work on apprenticeship funding policy. So my team is responsible for the policy from a funding and from a compliance perspective. So as part of this, we explain the policy in a document called the Apprenticeship Funding Rules, which you may have seen already, and if not, it's on gov.uk if you want to have a look. We also work with colleagues on the ASFA support desk that Nick mentioned to answer any queries that employers and providers ask us about off-the-job training. And we work with audit and compliance colleagues who help us to monitor this area as well. I think before we go any further though, I think it's important to say that Rob and I and the ESFA aren't delivery experts. So if you want information on the delivery of off-the-job training, you really do need to speak to a training provider. The objective of today's session is to explain the policy intent behind off-the-job training. So in other words, what it is, how does it work, and what are we trying to achieve by having this policy in the first place? We did deliver some webinars back in March, which you may have dialed into, and today's session does repeat some of that information. We have added a few new areas though, and we've brought the slides up to date to align with the latest set of funding rules. So I'm going to go through what we're going to cover today. So first of all, Rob's going to cover, and let me get this right, the what, why, when, where, who and how of off-the-job training. I think that's pretty much everything. Obviously we appreciate that some employers on the webinar might have been involved in apprenticeships for some time, but we also need to cater for people who are just getting started. And as Nick said, this is really kind of aimed as an introductory level webinar. I'm going to highlight some of the support material that is currently available and what we're doing next in this space. I'm also going to explain some of the language that a training provider might use about off-the-job training. So things like calculating, documenting, evidence, and so language like that, things that a provider might say to you. I'm going to go through some of that. And then at the end, I'm going to hand back to Rob, who's going to cover how you as an employer can support your apprentice and get the most from the programme. As Nick said, hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer the questions that have been submitted. So I hope that sounds okay as a broad outline for people. There is a lot to get through, so please bear with us. I'm now going to hand back over to Rob. So next slide, please.
Great, thanks Karen. So this first slide is the what of off-the-job training, and by this we mean the definition of the policy. The text on this slide is a direct lift from the definition in the 2021 Apprenticeship Funding Rules. This defines what off-the-job training is and highlights how it differs to on-the-job training. So let's take a look then at this first paragraph. So the definition, it is training which is received by the apprentice during the apprentice's normal working hours for the purpose of achieving the knowledge, skills and behaviours of the approved apprenticeship referenced in the apprenticeship agreement. By normal working hours, we mean the hours for which the apprentice would normally be paid, excluding overtime. You will see that I've put a part of this in bold, and it is these points that I want to cover in a bit more detail. So first point, off-the-job training must take place within normal working hours. This is because an apprenticeship is a work-based training programme. The training is designed to support the apprentice to become occupationally competent in the workplace, so it is right that the training takes place during the apprentice's normal working hours. it would be unfair to expect an apprentice to undertake an apprenticeship in their own time in addition to their job role. If training must, by exception, take place outside of the apprentice's normal working hours, we would expect this to be recognised, for example, through time off in lieu or by an additional payment to the apprentice. We do exclude overtime from the definition of normal working hours because overtime, by its very nature, is generally unplanned and is often related to pressure requirements in the business, for example, peak periods. If you or your company are unable to release your member of staff during normal working hours to undertake their off-the-job training, this person must not be engaged onto the apprenticeship programme. If they are already on the programme and can no longer be released, then they must be withdrawn immediately. Looking at the second point, next, then, knowledge, skills and behaviours. Off-the-job training is about the teaching of new knowledge, skills and behaviours that directly relate to the apprenticeship being followed. An apprenticeship will either be an older style apprenticeship framework or one of the newer style apprenticeship standards. For learners that are still on an older style framework, the training should align with the mandatory qualifications of the framework. The newer style employer-led apprenticeship standards concentrate less on mandatory qualifications and more on occupational competency. There are over 500 standards available, each supporting a specific job role. Each standard has a 2-page overview which describes what an occupationally competent person in the job role looks like. I put the links to where you can find further information on both at the bottom of this slide. Now looking at the third point, the apprenticeship agreement. This agreement is really important. Legally, it is this document, which is signed by you and the learner, which makes the individual an apprentice. This in turn gives the ESFA the power to fund their training. Even though the agreement is between you and the apprentice, we do require a copy to be given to the training provider so that they can keep this as part of their evidence pack. This is because without this agreement in place, the programme and the learner are not eligible for funding. I'm now going to move on to the second paragraph on the slide. Now this paragraph states, it is not on-the-job training, which is training received by the apprentice for the sole purpose of enabling the apprentice to perform the work for which they've been employed. By this we mean training that does not specifically link to the knowledge, skills and behaviours set out in the apprenticeship. So an apprenticeship is a job with a mix of both on and off the job training, but the ESFA only fund the off the job aspect, the training that is specifically listed in the apprenticeship framework or standard. The responsibility for on-the-job training lies with the employer. This might include activities which are required for the broader job role, but not specifically required for the apprenticeship. For example, an apprentice baker might need to understand the baking equipment and machinery used within their organisation, and also how to maintain and repair this machinery. This last part, the maintenance and repair aspect, is not listed as a requirement in the apprentice baker standard. But for some employers, especially smaller ones, it may still be a really important part of the job role. Where training is exclusively or solely needed to perform the job and is not part of the apprenticeship, this would be regarded as on-the-job training rather than off-the-job. So the maintenance training in this example would be for the employer to organise and fund. Okay, I'll now move on to the next slide. So moving on to what we call the 4 tests. We have listed some examples of what can and can't be included as off-the-job training in the apprenticeship funding rules. But if in doubt, a good check is to use what we call the 4 tests. These are listed on this slide. So first of all, is the person signed up to the apprenticeship programme? By this we mean, is there an apprenticeship agreement in place, and has the provider sent in the appropriate information to the ESFA to trigger funding? Second point, is the activity directly relevant to the apprenticeship? This goes back to making sure there is alignment between the training being delivered and the specific requirements of the apprenticeship, and making sure that any training that is solely needed for the job role is excluded. Third point, is the activity teaching new knowledge, skills and behaviours? We don't pay for prior learning that the individual already has on joining the apprenticeship programme, only the training that teaches new skills. And finally, the fourth point, is the learning taking place in the apprentice's normal working hours, which is what we talked about earlier? If you can answer yes to these 4 questions, then the likelihood is that the activity is off the job training. I'll now move on to the next slide. So let's ask ourselves the question, why do we have an off-the-job training policy at all? Put simply, off-the-job training is a statutory requirement of an English apprenticeship. It ensures the apprentice is upskilled to learn new knowledge, skills and behaviours. Without it, the programme cannot be considered to be valid. We have set a minimum entitlement for all apprentices. Apprentices must spend at least 20% of their normal working hours over the planned duration of the training period on off-the-job training. The programme is not eligible for government funding unless this condition is met. As an apprentice employer, you must make sure that you are supporting your apprentices to take the time away from their usual tasks, i.e. their productive role, to complete their off-the-job training. The diagram on the slide explains that for the newer apprenticeship standards, the programme is split into 2 distinct parts: the practical training period, which is at the front, and the endpoint assessment, which is at the end. The practical training period is where new knowledge, skills and behaviours are delivered, usually by a training provider. This must last for a minimum of 12 months. If the learner requires less than this minimum, they are not eligible for an apprenticeship. The endpoint assessment period is where the training delivered is then independently assessed by an endpoint assessment organisation. We are often asked about the practical impact and the financial burden that the 20% policy places on employers, particularly small employers, and why the minimum requirement was set at 20% rather than 10% or 15%. It's important, I think, to recognise that an individual will only be engaged in off-the-job training if they are an apprentice, and they should only be an apprentice if you, as their employer, have agreed that they require significant new learning to be occupationally competent and able to perform their job effectively. If the individual does not require this level of training and can perform their job without it, then they should not be engaged in an apprenticeship. If they're not engaged, then the off-the-job training policy will never apply. An apprenticeship is one of many programs on the market, and a different program may be a better fit for an individual or their particular circumstances, for example, those that require a smaller amount of training, or those where an employer can't commit to the release of the individual within normal working hours. For those that are engaged, we accept that there may be an initial loss of productivity due to the time that the apprentice is in training, but in the long term, the new skills that this person brings back to the workplace should compensate for this. So now looking at in relation to why 20% was chosen. A lot of apprenticeships were already delivered on a day release basis, and this broadly equated to 1 day per week or 20% of the apprentice's time. We then made comparisons with other countries before a percentage was agreed for the programme in England. This included programmes that are often cited as world-class, such as those in Switzerland and Germany, both of which have significantly higher requirements of off-the-job training. For example, in Germany, around 30% of an apprentice's time is spent off-the-job training for a minimum of 2 years. If you want to understand more about how the English programme compares to those in other countries, there are a couple of references that you might find useful. The first is a report that you can search for by the Gatsby Foundation called Taking Training Seriously. That's by the Gatsby Foundation. This report concluded that 20% should be the bare minimum if England is to compete internationally with other apprenticeship programmes. The second reference is the location on the OECD website that compares off-the-job training data for various countries. Right, we'll move on to the next slide now. So, moving on to the when and where. So first of all, when. As we said earlier, off-the-job training must take place in the apprentice's normal working hours. If training must take place outside of these hours, we expect this to be recognised, for example, through time off in lieu or by an additional payment to the apprentice. The delivery of the apprenticeship content is flexible, and there are various models that a provider may be able to offer. It is up to you and the training provider to decide the model. You might be comfortable with the day release model, where the training is delivered pretty much evenly over the duration of the programme, 1 day per week. You may want the training to be front-loaded, with more training delivered at the beginning, with a tapered-off approach towards the end. You may prefer concentrated blocks of delivery, for example, 1 week out of every 5, or some other variation. Which model you choose will depend on what the provider can offer and what's best for you and the apprentice. I'm now going to talk about where. It is also up to you and the provider to agree where training takes place. We acknowledge that the name of the policy, off-the-job training, can sometimes cause confusion. Whilst the training must be off the job, by this we mean away from the productive job role, it doesn't necessarily need to be away from the workplace. Training can take place at an employer's workplace, and it can even take place at the apprentice's workstation. Alternatively, it can take place off-site, for example, in a provider's classroom, or from home via distance learning. It is the activity rather than the location that determines whether the training meets the definition set out in the apprenticeship funding rules. Now, we are often asked if a live environment can be used for off-the-job training. Off-the-job training must be separate from the productive or normal day job. However, a live environment is sometimes required in order to check transferability of knowledge. For example, it would be difficult for an apprentice in a retail or customer service environment to learn new skills without customers, or an apprentice bus driver to develop their skills without any interaction with passengers. However, a live environment shouldn't be used all the time, as this essentially means that the apprentice is still performing their productive work role and isn't being released for training. A live environment can only be used for off-the-job training while the apprentice is learning new knowledge, skills and behaviours. Move to the next slide now. So, moving on to the who and how. first of all looking at who. Ultimately, the organisation that we fund, which in most cases is a training provider, is responsible for making sure that the minimum policy requirement is met. But this doesn't mean that the training provider must deliver all of the training. Before the start of the apprenticeship, the provider, employer and apprentice must agree what we call a commitment statement. This represents each party's commitment and contribution to the programme and includes the training plan. When the training plan is being prepared, you and the training provider should agree who is the best party to deliver each aspect of the required training. In most cases, it will all fall naturally to the training provider. However, there may be some circumstances where you, as the employer, are better placed to deliver something, and this may be due to sector expertise or equipment that is only available within your organisation. Any party can deliver off-the-job training, but funding can only be received by organisations that are on the ESFA Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. This register can include employers, and being on the register may be something you want to pursue if you are spending a lot of time delivering off-the-job training delivery as detailed in the training plan, and you want to be financially compensated for this. If you did go down this route, then essentially you would be a subcontractor of the training provider so that they could pass funding to you. And I'll talk about the how. By this we mean how the training is delivered, the delivery methodology. Again, ultimately, this should be agreed at the beginning between you and the training provider. It can include face-to-face delivery, practical training, and distance or online learning. Before COVID, it's fair to say that a lot of apprenticeship delivery was face-to-face and took place at the provider's premises or by the tutor coming to the workplace. With COVID, delivery has naturally evolved to include more distance or online learning, which is fine. As individuals have different learning preferences, good off-the-job training would ideally have more than one delivery method. For example, a combination of face-to-face delivery with some online learning and group work. So I think that covers the what, why, when, where, who, and how of off-the-job training. I'm now going to hand over to Karen.
Thanks, Rob.
Next slide, please.
So that was quite a lot of information for everyone to take in. What I want to do now is run through some of the support materials that we've got in this area that might help. So what you can see at the top of the slide is a link. Although to be fair, if you just Google off the job training, because it's a gov.uk page link, it'll probably be the first one that comes up in your results. So this page, the gov.uk page, is where we house our off the job training support materials. And the first thing you'll see on the gov.uk page is the off-the-job guide, which is the guide that's pictured on the slide. So this guide's full of content. It's got practical examples, it's got questions and answers, all about the policy, and it really supports kind of people's understanding of the area, and it also supports the apprenticeship funding rules as well. So the content's aimed at employers and at providers, and it's aimed at both parties really because you both need to have a shared understanding of the policy, so we don't produce separate things for the two groups. We produce the same thing and we aim it at both. We're currently on version 3, which was published last September. We're in the process of updating this guide. So version 4, the draft of version 4, is currently being tested internally and with sector representatives. And when I say sector representatives, I mean we've got a sort of representative panel that includes employers and providers. So they're kind of giving us feedback on the draft of version 4 at the moment. And we hope to publish mid to end November, depending on the feedback that we get. So in version 4, we've added lots more questions and answers, including the ones that we received in the off-the-job webinars back in March. And if we get any new questions today that aren't in the guide, then we'll pop them in too. I think if there's anything else that would be useful in this type of guide, then please let us know by contacting the support desk. Next slide, please. So also on the gov.uk page, you'll find this. It's a simple infographic about what off-the-job training is. It's a really useful reminder. So it summarises a lot of what Rob's covered so far. So for an activity to be considered as off-the-job training, it needs to be directly relevant to the apprenticeship standard or framework. It's got to teach new knowledge, skills and behaviours, and it must take place in the apprentice's normal working hours. So the last point on this infographic around English and maths is a point that we haven't already covered, and it's that off-the-job training doesn't include English and maths training to level 2. And the reason for this is that whilst English and maths can be a very important part of the programme for some apprentices, not every apprentice will need this training, so it's regarded as additional to the 20% entitlement that Rob talked about. Next slide, please. And then finally, we've got a myth buster. So this addresses the top myths around the policy. Have a look at this on gov.uk. If there's any more myths that you think you'd like us to bust in an updated version, again, please let us know. I mean, we've heard that the infographic and the myth buster in particular are really well liked by employers. That's the feedback we've had so far. Both of those are one-page A4 documents, so they're really easy just to print off and have as a handy reference guide. So that's why we've kind of done it in that way. Next slide, please. So this next part of the presentation is about some of the language that a training provider might use with you in relation to your apprentice or the apprenticeship programme. So the first thing to say is that before a provider can even deliver any training, they've first got to establish learner and programme eligibility and keep the associated evidence of that. And they have to do that for us as the funding body. So to establish eligibility, they'll do what they call an initial assessment of the individual. And this is to confirm a number of things. So the first one's learner eligibility. And when we talk about learner eligibility, we're talking about things like the person's age, their residency conditions, so things like that. Programme eligibility. So this includes confirming to us that the training need meets the minimum 20% entitlement that we've been talking about. They'll also discuss with the apprentice any relevant prior learning that they've done. So it's important to know about prior learning so that training isn't repeated. So basically, apprentices should not be spending non-productive time in the workplace doing training that they don't need. This provides poor value for you as the employer, and the apprentice will likely have a poor experience too if they're going to be repeating things that they already know. So it's really important to identify that prior learning right at the beginning. The provider will also probably want to talk to you about alignment of the apprenticeship with the job role. So if the apprentice is spending a minimum of 20% of their time on off-the-job training, then the other 80% they're going to be doing the productive day job. And part of that time is about consolidating and embedding the new skills that they've gained from the apprenticeship back into the workplace. And if there's a mismatch between the apprenticeship and the training that they're getting and their job role, then this is going to be much harder to achieve. So once the provider's done the initial assessment and they've got the individual starting point, they'll then design, with your help and input, a training plan. They'll need to agree the curriculum with you and agree how much off-the-job training is required. And when I say how much, by that I mean a volume of training hours. They'll also need to agree with you the when and the where that training will be delivered, everything that Rob talked about, and who's best to deliver each component, them or you. Please remember, the programme is flexible. This is your opportunity to influence the direction of the apprenticeship for your member of staff. So please get involved at the very, very beginning. Next slide, please. The next area I want to come on to is documenting, so the paperwork that surrounds the apprenticeship programme. The training provider will need to make sure that the planned volume of off-the-job training that they've agreed with you, so the number of hours, is documented in 3 places. So the apprenticeship agreement, and remember, as Rob said, this is a legal agreement between you and the apprentice. So we can't fund an apprenticeship unless there's a valid apprenticeship agreement in place. And the agreement itself is not valid if it's incomplete. And one of the things that the agreement has to have on it is a planned number of training hours, a volume of training hours. So the second place they have to document it is the commitment statement, so the training plan. So this is a working document which should be referred to regularly to make sure the apprentice is on track. They also need to document it. The provider sends us what we call an ILR. So that's an individualised learner record. And basically, this is the form that triggers the funding to be released to the provider. So we need to know the number of training hours that the provider has calculated for the programme so that we can be sure we're funding an eligible programme before we release any public money. At the end of the programme, when all the training's been delivered, we also need to know the actual volume of training hours that your apprentice has received. And this is so we can compare it to the original plan that the provider first told us about that they agreed with you. Next slide, please. So this final part of this section is around evidence and off-the-job training. I think Rob referred to it earlier that the provider must keep a file called an evidence pack for every apprentice. In this evidence pack, the provider has to keep details of all the off-the-job training that's been delivered against the agreed commitment statement. Providers are sometimes audited by ESFA and to make sure they're following the apprenticeship funding rules. And from an audit perspective, we need to understand if the right quantity of training is being delivered and whether this quantity is going to meet the minimum 20%. But beyond the quantity itself, we also need to know if the training meets the definition of off-the-job training. So thinking back to the 4 tests that Rob talked about, was the person on the programme at the time of delivery? Was it relevant? Was it in normal working hours? Was it in new knowledge, skills and behaviours? That's what an auditor will be looking for. The training provider, as the recipient of the funding, is responsible for the evidence pack, but they may need to work with you or the apprentice to collect evidence outside of their control. So what I mean by that is if, for example, the evidence was learner-based, so the learner was doing some training and they, as part of the evidence requirement, they were completing a learning log or a learning journal, for example, the provider would need to have that so that they knew how long the person had spent on that task. So the provider will talk to you about what they need from you in this space. It's also worth knowing that other organisations, Ofsted, the Office for Students and the Quality Assurance Agency have a role in inspecting and regulating the quality of off-the-job training. And therefore the provider will also have to keep other information about your apprentice that is more qualitative in nature. As an example, Ofsted are interested in what an apprentice can do as a result of their apprenticeship programme that they weren't able to do before it. And you may be asked to contribute towards that assessment. Next slide, please. So the absolute top query that we receive in ESFA with regards to evidence is around planned and actual hours. So what I mean by that is what happens if the actual hours that are delivered by a training provider at the end of the programme are less than the original planned hours that were agreed with you back in the beginning. So I want to say a little bit more about the ESFA's expectations here. I'm just going through these 4 points. So number 1, so as we've discussed at the start of the programme, you, the provider and the apprentice will have agreed a training plan. And that training plan will have included a volume of training hours that you all agreed were needed by the apprentice to develop their occupational competency. And this is the programme we've agreed to fund. So our expectation, the expectation of the ESFA is that this volume of training is what's going to be delivered. But moving on to point 3, we accept that sometimes plans change, especially with longer programmes. Sometimes information comes to light during the programme, and sometimes this means the actual volume of training delivered might be less than the original plan. And there might be good reasons for that. And I'm just going to go through 3 examples of why that might happen. So an apprentice might be a fast learner. So what we mean by that is that they may have consumed the full content of training quicker than anybody ever imagined. Obviously, apprentices are individuals, people learn at different speeds, so it's possible that they might not need the total number of planned hours. There might have been changes in the delivery methodology. So at the beginning of the programme, for example, it might have been agreed in terms of how the training was being delivered, that it was going to be predominantly delivered in a classroom. And then because of coronavirus, for example, that might have changed to more distance or online learning. And generally online learning might take less time than classroom delivery. So again, that has an impact on the number of hours. And the third example is where prior learning is identified during a programme. Sometimes as part of the initial assessment, when the provider and the apprentice have their discussion around what the apprentice already knows, the apprentice might not recognise some of the terminology, they might not understand sort of some of the skills that the provider's referencing. And it might only be when they start doing the training, they think, oh, actually, I've done this before, I don't need to do this. So there might be, you know, prior learning that comes to light sort of during the programme rather than just at the beginning. And again, that has an impact on the number of hours. So if the actual number of hours delivered is less than the planned number of hours agreed with you at the beginning, what the provider needs to do is produce a summary statement to document the reason for the difference. And if you and the apprentice are happy with what, you know, the training that was received, even though it was less than the original plan, you both have to sign the statement so the provider can keep it on file in case of an audit from us. Obviously, if you're not happy with what was received, or you're not happy at any point in the programme, you need to discuss this immediately with your provider. Next slide, please. The last part of my bit touches on two common changes in circumstance and the impact that these might have on off-the-job training. So the first one is around when apprentices' weekly hours might increase or decrease, and we get a lot of queries like this at the minute because of obviously everything that's going on and impact on people's job roles. So where this happens, typically the thing we get asked is, how does it impact on off-the-job training? Does the calculation need to be redone? And generally what we would say there is no. So even though the apprentice's hours might have changed, the quantity of training that everyone agreed, so you, the provider, the apprentice, agreed at the beginning of the programme, that volume hasn't changed, that requirement's still the same, but how you deliver the training might need to change. So if the person has gone from, say, 37 hours to 30 hours or whatever, what we advise the provider and you do is to discuss the impact of that change and consider a number of points. So can the apprentice continue to study for the same volume of hours per week? Has that changed, you know, from, like I said, from 37 to 30? Has that impacted on what they can do each week? Can it still be delivered in their working hours? And also, is the ability of the apprentice to undertake endpoint assessment impacted? So by that, what we mean is the on-the-job bit, so their transferability to the workplace. Do they have enough time to develop occupational competence if they're you know, working less hours? If there is a material impact, then the plan may need to be adjusted and perhaps extended even. And if there's no impact, then you can just continue as before. The second change I'm going to come on to is maternity. So on the 1st of April this year, we made a change to our off-the-job policy in relation to maternity, adoption and shared parental leave. And we basically said that people could use their statutory keep in touch days for off-the-job training. And we introduced this policy change to support two very specific scenarios, which is what's on the slide. So to support those apprentices who are about to embark on a period of maternity leave, for example, who had minimal, and by minimal I mean single digit, training sessions left and wanted to continue with their training rather than waiting until their return to work, which might have been a year later. So they wanted to keep that momentum going and just finish the programme off. And also we wanted to support those apprentices who were training with a cohort, where the cohort was starting prior to their scheduled return to work. So for example, the cohort was going to start back in September, but the apprentice's maternity leave wasn't due to finish until October. So using their kit days would allow them to start with their cohort. So where kit days are to be used, where you all agree, you, the apprentice and the provider want to use kit days, the provider has to complete an agreement so we understand how the kit day is being used. And the apprenticeship funding rules outline what this agreement must contain, the information that it contains. And where kit days aren't being used, then we use what we call a break in learning, and that can be used for the full period away from work, so the full maternity leave. And this essentially means the apprenticeship is paused and the person can pick it back up again when they come back to work. So that's the end of my input, and I'm now going to hand back over to Rob on how to support an apprentice.
Great, thanks, Karen. So moving on now to the final part of the webinar, we're going to look at some of the ways you can support the apprentice to successfully complete their apprenticeship. We are often asked about terms and conditions of apprentices. I think the important point here is to recognise that an apprenticeship is a job with training. They are employed by you. So any policies and procedures you have in place for other staff should apply to apprentices too. You don't have to create separate conditions. Understanding the requirements of the apprenticeship. Before the apprenticeship starts, we've already mentioned that you and the apprentice will need to sign an apprenticeship agreement. This is a legal requirement to enable apprenticeship funding to be accessed, and your provider could give you a template to complete and tell you more about this document. Now, we've already touched on the commitment statement. This is signed by all three parties, you, the apprentice, and the training provider. It details the commitment each party is making to the apprenticeship programme and contains the training plan. You should be involved in creating and agreeing the training plan. This is a working document that should be referred to and used in regular progress reviews of the apprentice. One of the agreements you are making in signing up to the commitment statement is to release the apprentice for their off-the-job training during their normal working hours. You should discuss how this will work with the training provider and the apprentice and agree days and timings to fit in with the business. Looking at the next point, you should assign a line manager or supervisor to the apprentice who can do the following. Firstly, induct the apprentice and help them to understand how their job role fits into the wider business. Understand and discuss the training plan with the apprentice and provide regular and constructive feedback on their progress and areas for improvement. You also need to make sure they have sufficient opportunities to embed their new knowledge, skills and behaviours in the workplace. Provide encouragement and signpost the apprentice to any additional support needed. Sometimes larger organisations have apprentice or peer-to-peer support networks, and these can be really beneficial. You need to take part in regular progress review meetings with a training provider and your apprentice. Your input is key here. Now, where the apprentice is following a standard, help them to prepare for their final endpoint assessment and discuss their options after the apprenticeship is complete. Also, be an advocate for their work and celebrate their successes, helping others in the business to understand the apprenticeship programme and the achievements of the apprentice. Award ceremonies for apprentices can really help them feel valued. So thank you very much for listening today. That's the end of our presentation now. We hope you found it useful. I'm now going to hand back to Nick for questions.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Karen. That was a really useful, thorough update on off-the-job training. Listen, guys, I know we've probably overrun where I anticipated us being at the moment. I thought we would have lasted about 45 minutes. I do hope you can stay with us for the questions, and there's a couple of other slides once we've gone through the Q&A session. So if you don't mind, I'll kick off with the Q&A, so some of the questions that we've had in from people. My first question, Karen, if I can ask you, when does off-the-job training actually commence? Is it from the date of the apprenticeship agreement, or from the date of the practical period, or the date that the practical period starts?
So in terms of off-the-job training, it's the practical period start date, but if you're talking about the apprenticeship agreement, on the agreement itself, there are two start dates. So there's the start date of the apprenticeship, which is the job with the combination of on and off the job training, as Rob described, and then there's the start date for the practical period, which is the off the job training that we fund. And you know, there could be a gap between those two things. So what I mean by that is, you know, a new person could be coming into the organisation with a start date of, say, the 1st of September, and their practical period start date might be the 1st of October. So it's all arranged and everything, but the provider isn't obviously going to be sitting waiting for them on day one, you know, the start date of their job. They're going to sort of do that slightly later, and that's absolutely fine.
Okay, I've got another one for you as well, Karen, if I may. There's a question here, well, it's a comment that says that each individual apprentice is just that, they're individual. So to achieve their competence, their timing can vary. So how do the employer account for that?
I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, everyone is individual. I think part of that is the initial assessment. So it's a determination of what the apprentice needs at the beginning. That should drive kind of how long their program is and what it is they need in that program. And that might be completely different from somebody who's following the same apprenticeship, who even might work with that person. You might have two people, same organisation, same job. They might have different apprenticeship needs, and that's really for the provider and the employer to make sure it's captured in the initial assessment.
Okay, cool, thank you. Rob, a question for you, if I may. Is there a minimum number of hours an employee must be employed for to qualify to undertake an apprenticeship?
Well, an apprenticeship must be 12 months of minimum duration, and we would expect for there to be 20% of off-the-job training. We would be expecting sort of at least 30 hours for the apprenticeship.
Okay, brilliant. Karen, there's quite a good point here about the 20% stuff and how it applies to the endpoint assessment period. So does the 20% continue through EPA?
No, so the 20% is just on the practical period. So that's from the start of the practical period to the end, and the end point is, we often call it, they might hear the term gateway, and that's essentially the bridge between the practical period and the endpoint assessment. So by the time the person undertakes endpoint assessment, that 20% entitlement, that should have been done, that should have been met.
Okay, brilliant. There was I think you mentioned again, Karen, in part of your presentation, something around the provider needing to determine eligibility, and we mentioned age as one of those requirements about determining eligibility. So the employer has commented that they thought that the age over 16, or anybody over the age of 16, could be eligible to undertake an apprenticeship. So why is age part of the eligibility?
I mean, you're right. Well, technically, you could be 15 as long as you've passed the school leaving date in the year that you are 16. But obviously, we need to make sure that that condition has been met. Because obviously, you know, in normal years, this year obviously being a slight exception, exams could happen kind of in May. You might not turn sick. You might try to start an apprenticeship program slightly too early. So the provider does need to make sure that you have left the school system. So that's why we ask them to check age.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And again, another one for you. So there's the employers asked or commented that they've already issued apprentice agreements to their individual apprentices. Do we need to go back now and edit them to reflect the volume of training hours?
Well, yes, your apprenticeship agreement does need to include a volume of training hours, or it's, you know, if it's not complete, like we said, from a legal point of view, it's not valid. But your provider should really maybe have picked that up. So if this has been asked by an employer, I would just ask them to maybe go back and speak to their provider, just in case the provider has actually added that information to an agreement that the employer might have provided, because it would be very unusual for a provider not to have spotted that, I think.
Yeah, okay, cool. And there's a couple of questions about kit days. So I think this is the maternity kit days. So is there a standard template that can be used to draw up an agreement between the employer and the provider? And can kit days be used for learners with more than single-digit sessions left?
So there's no pro forma, but in the apprenticeship funding rules, we do say what needs to be covered in the agreement. So what we're trying to do there really is protect all the parties. So we don't want the apprentice to feel that they have to use their kit days on an apprenticeship. It needs to be their decision. So that's why it's an agreement that's signed by all three people. And it just documents how many kit days are going to be used, when they're going to be used, and so on. So it's not a pro forma, but there is a clear sort of outline of what needs to be included. And in terms of the single digit thing, I suppose kind of you're constrained by your number of kit days. So for maternity and adoption leave, there are 10 kit days, and you might want to use some of that time on work-related things outside of the apprenticeship. So that might leave even less time that you could spend on off-the-job training. So it's really constrained between, you know, how many kit days you've got and what else you're planning on doing with that.
Okay, Rob, a question about clarifying what's meant by competitions. So is in terms of off the job, what off the job can include. So what's covered? Is it the preparation for the competition or just the competition itself?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That's an interesting question, actually. Well, it's likely that participation, first of all, you know, it might mean different things for different sectors and for different types of competition. I mean, really, ultimately, the scope of the activity needs to be agreed between the apprentice, provider, employer, and the activity must meet the definition of off-the-job training that we talked about. So, you know, we want to see that the activity is about new knowledge, skills, and behaviours. And so, if that activity is providing new knowledge, skills, and behaviours, then then it would qualify for off-the-job training.
Okay. I'm not sure who to ask this one to. It was about degree apprentices. So I've had a number of questions about degree apprenticeships and how 20% off the job should apply, particularly during non-term time. Could one of you sort of shed some light on that?
Yeah, I can pick that up. So when the 20% calculation is done, statutory leave's already taken out of that, so that allows for you know, the person not to be, you know, physically trained for 52 weeks a year. But and then it's up to the employer and the provider to design a programme around kind of when training can take place, and you might want to include in that if the provider has closed down for summer holidays and things like that. But I think the other important thing to say is that off-the-job training doesn't have to take place at a provider's, or it doesn't even have to take place with a provider. So the provider could have left the person some work to do, for example, and that would be fine. It's still being guided by the provider, even though they're not physically there when it's being done. So things like summer holidays and shutdowns and things like that shouldn't really have that much of an impact.
Okay, brilliant. I've got a question. I think it's been reflected in one sort of particular question that's come up, but it's something that has occurred to me. Where's the evidence for off-the-job training kept? Is it kept by the apprentice or by the provider, the tutor?
So I can pick that up. So I think, you know, ultimately it is the party that we fund. So normally it's the training provider who has to keep the evidence. So every apprentice has to have an evidence pack that the provider keeps. But that evidence might be generated by another party. So like I was saying before, the apprentice might keep a learning journal or learning log. You know, there might be timesheets that an employer kind of produces that indicates when off-the-job training's happened in the workplace. So the evidence itself could be generated by another party, but it is the responsibility of the training provider to collect it and keep it, because ultimately they're the party we fund. And if the evidence is missing, they're the party that we would need to kind of speak to and potentially take action against.
Okay, cool. I've got another couple of questions, if I may, and then I'll skip on to the next part. How do we find the 20% off the job if the apprentice has a 0-hour contract in place?
So Rob mentioned about 30 hours before. So if you're doing anything less than 30 hours, so you could do a 12-month program if you're on a 30-hour contract. If you're doing anything less than 30 hours, that program has to be extended to sort of compensate for the reduction in hours. So if you're on a 0 hours contract, you would have to have a discussion. The employer and the provider would have to have a discussion around kind of what the norm would be in that. So even though a lot of people have 0 hours contracts, their norm might be a particular kind of level of hours, and that's what they would base the off-the-job training and the extension to the program on. Now, obviously, if that changed, like I was saying before about people's hours changing because of COVID in particular, that would have to be re-examined around kind of, does the programme need to be further extended because they're not able to do everything that they could have done at the beginning of the programme. So it is really a discussion between the employer and the provider about how the contract itself impacts on the delivery of off-the-job training.
Okay, brilliant. And then a question about what happens with the apprentice when they reach the end of their practical period but maybe isn't ready for their endpoint assessment. Do employers still need to continue providing 20% off the job training?
So, well, they could reach the end of their planned practical period and still not be competent, but they shouldn't kind of. So at the end of the practical period, there has to be an assessment and a sort of agreement by the provider and the employer that the person's competent and ready to undertake endpoint assessment. So really, if they've got to the end of their plan and they're not, the employer doesn't think they are competent enough to undertake endpoint assessment, training must still be continued to deliver. So the programme will be extended, the commitment statement might need to be reviewed and updated to include additional training or refresher training, and we would take it from there.
Okay, excellent. Right, okay, I'm going to call halt to the end of the questions there because we are dangerously overrunning now. Karen, there was just one thing we were talking about before we move on to that to talk about the support videos and other things. Karen, you were talking about the guidance document and the new format for the guidance document, and the plans to possibly extend the document to include some Q&A within that, but that obviously means that it's a weightier document. So I think, if I'm right, Karen, but please butt in if I've not got this correct. What you're looking for is if we could get the guys that are still on the call just to type into the question box whether you would like to see what you think of the idea of a bigger guidance document around off-the-job training that includes some of the real questions that employers have asked us and the answers to that. Is that a good thing, do you think, or a bad thing in terms of how we present the guidance?
And just to add to that, so version 3 of the guide that I mentioned before, I think that's currently about 39 pages. In the draft we've got for version 4 adds another 20 pages of that, but those 20 pages are all real questions that we got asked in the March webinars. So if a person contacts our service desk, for example, they will get the answer, but it's only them who get the answer, not everybody else. And the beauty of putting things into the guide is that everyone's got access to the questions and answers rather than just that one person who's asked the question. But obviously it makes it a longer document, and we just need to find that, the right balance.
Okay. I mean, thank you guys. I mean, you can stop putting your feedback into the questions box now. I mean, overwhelmingly, Karen and Rob, people are thinking that it's a good idea. There's a couple of people saying that I think actually the guidance as it stands is okay, but overwhelmingly the responses seem to indicate it would be a really good thing to include reference to those questions. And what we'll do as well is we'll make sure that Karen and Rob have got copies of the questions that everybody's asked today, so that they can consider those for the guidance documents in future editions, so we can make sure that gets put over. Right, so sorry for overrunning, but I'll take just a minute or two of your time, if I may. I just want to talk to you about the support videos, so just take this opportunity to remind you about the ESFA Gov UK YouTube channel. We've now got 3 playlists on there. So all support videos about the different functions of using the apprenticeships are in the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist. Any existing recordings from our webinars and the future webinar recordings will be available in the Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings playlist. And any videos just that have been created to support the delivery of apprenticeships will be available in the Apprenticeship Support video playlist. We have more videos and webinar recordings all the time, so we'll be publishing those. We'll obviously have a copy of today's webinar recording in that playlist, probably in about 2 weeks, maybe just a little bit over. So please do subscribe to our channel and click on the bell icon to get alerts when new content is uploaded. We're going to move to the next slide, please. If you don't already, I'd urge you to follow us on Twitter at ESFA Digital. We tweet lots of stuff around new developments within the service updates and information about forthcoming webinars. So it really is a great way of keeping up to date with the latest news. Move to the next slide, please. So on to further support. Now, you'll see on here lots and lots and lots of links to various different things. What we've done is we have put together a PDF document which with all of these details on, which you should now be able to access from the control panel under the handout section. So you won't have to scribble down all of these links. They refer to some of the links that Karen and Rob have mentioned during their presentations as well. But just to summarise, for the Mythbuster document that Karen was talking about, go to gov.uk. The off-the-job training policy is also on gov.uk. Rob mentioned taking training seriously. You can find that at gatsby.org.uk. Other ways to stay up to date with information is our ESFA digital blog. We put together a new topics at around once a fortnight. To register for any future webinars, you should follow the link on screen and in that document. You'll also be able to access an on-demand recording of today's webinar from that link as well. This recording will be available for 2 weeks or so whilst we're getting the other one ready for our YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, obviously, the recording will be available on the YouTube channel as well in a few weeks' time. We also put articles for employers in our business update newsletter, so please do have a look at those. And then obviously, if you've got specific queries about the apprenticeship service, you can also go to the new self-service support tool, or you can contact the helpline on 08000 150 600 to speak to one of the advisors, and you can email them as well. The contact details are obviously on the slide. So that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so very much for joining us, and thank you for those that have stayed with us right to the end. Thanks also to Karen and Rob for their insight. Please remember, as you sign off, just complete the short survey. We really do value your feedback and use it to help us improve what we deliver. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.